So SwiftUI Basics. What we're going to cover is the text view. That's going to be the hello world that we print out on our iPhone. The modifiers, what they mean and how they're used. And then we're going to cover some what we call power tools like the V-stack, the H-stack, and the Z-stack. And we'll put all of this together to see how we can build some pretty neat UI with just these particular concepts. First, let me just show a diagram that has basically an iPhone over on the right-hand side, and then we have some code over here on the left. And this is what I want to focus on. So first, again, the code that you see here is potentially not code that's going to be understood by anybody at this point in the course structure, but it's really not relevant. So this particular code right here that's highlighted and this next piece of code that's highlighted is code that I just want you to consider to be boilerplate and that you can ignore it. But this is the code that when we get into Xcode and we do our first Hello World program, that code is going to be given to us by Xcode. We don't have to write it ourselves. It's already supplied. And then we don't need to worry about changing it in any way. We can't delete it. And we don't want to change it, but we can just leave it where it is, and then we can move on with the stuff that's more interesting and doing the UI that we want to build. So really where we're focusing in on is this code that's right here and is really in between these two brackets, and that's where we're going to build up our UI. So in this example, this is actually showing the concept of a text view. We'll be mentioning views all the time, and views are basically just, as you might expect, images or graphics that show up on our iPhone. And views will typically have a size associated with them. They'll have a position associated with them. But SwiftUI sort of abstracts a lot of that away for us, so it makes it really easy. But everything that goes on your iPhone that you see is going to be a view of some type. So in this case, we're talking about a text view. So the way we do that is we invoke this thing called text, and then in parentheses, we can put a string, and that whatever string we put in there is actually what's going to show up on our iPhone here. And there are all sorts of views that we will be able to take advantage of. So for example, I've just listed, a short 10 or 15 of them, but there are 40 or 50 different types of views that are come right out of the box in SwiftUI to help us build up our UI. And you can create your own views and your own custom views to reuse in your app or in other apps that you build. So there's really no limit on this. But these are some of the fundamental ones. And as you can see right here at the top, V-stack, H-stack, and Z-stack are three views that we'll talk about in this module and are pretty fundamental to building stuff up on your phone. So those would be potentially replacing or wrapping around text, and we'll see how that works when we get to it. So now that we've talked about a view and we've talked about text and how we have that here on our phone, the next thing I want to do is talk about modifiers. So modifiers are a way that we can take the standard view of whatever it is we are building up and modify it in some way and then sort of send that up the line to a parent view for it to work with. So in this case, the way we do that is we do this syntax of a dot with whatever modifier name we're going to use, and then in parentheses, whatever arguments we want to pass to the modifier. So a modifier is basically something that will modify the thing that it's attached to. So for example, here we have this view called text, and then we've added a modifier called .foreground_color. And what .foreground_color does is it basically changes the text foreground color, and therefore instead of it being black, the text ends up being blue because we said color.blue here. So that's our first modifier. Now I'm going to show you some cool tricks in Xcode to bring up these modifiers for you so that you don't have to remember the actual name here. So this is the foreground color modifier. Now the next thing we can do is we can chain these modifiers together. So I can't or I'm not stuck with just using one modifier. I can put in as many modifiers as I want. So I can add another one here called background. Now, background is not called background color just because there's a lot of different types of backgrounds you might want to put on your view. It could be an image, it could be a gradient. In this case, it's a color, but it could be any number of different things. And therefore, the modifier is just referred to as background as opposed to background color. And then the argument that you're putting in here is what's the view that you want to have be your background. And it turns out in SwiftUI, color is also a view, just like text. And so therefore, color.yellow basically is a view that's all colored yellow. So if we give it a yellow view and we say that that's your background, we now have a background placed on our text view of yellow. And then again, we can keep going. So the third one is, say, padding. So what I'm doing is saying dot padding here with an open and closed paren, and I'll get to that in a minute. But what it did is the view actually expanded. So this little blue line doesn't actually show up on your real UI, but it will show up on our canvas in Xcode, and you'll see that when we get to it. And it's kind of showing you the border of where your view is. And you'll notice how that border actually expanded out by, in this case, 20 pixels in all four directions. And it gave us that nice padding around the text. So again, we did these modifiers, and one of the key things about modifiers is that the order that you apply them does matter, because you keep moving up the chain when you go from view to view to view all the way up to the parent. So what this is saying is that we start with a text view. That becomes our lowest level view. And then as we move up, we say, well, we're going to add a foreground color. Great. Okay, now we're going to add a background color. Great. Now we're going to add a padding to that. And that order is what created this over here. So the question I have is, what do you think this UI will look like if you were to change the order of those two modifiers? So basically, we're going to call padding first and then background color. So this is something I would open up to the class for discussion and see what they think. So the reality is that if you do that, you will actually create, even though you have the padding, now the padding takes on the background color as well. And we can see that by just stepping through this again. First, we have the text. Then we have the foreground color, setting the text color to blue. Then we have the padding. So we haven't applied any background color yet. We've expanded the view out to include the padding of 20 pixels on each side. And then we have the background color applied. So the background color was applied after the padding was applied. And now we get this view versus this view. So this is pretty fundamental and something that we want to reinforce over time as we go through SwiftUI, is if things don't seem to work like what we want, a lot of times it's just the order is wrong. And it's something that you want to work through and check. Now, it is also the case that some modifiers order won't matter. So for example, moving foreground color around, since the others don't depend on it, it wouldn't matter where you applied it. You would apply the foreground color, whether you applied it first or last. In this case, you're going to get the foreground color without any difference in what you see over here. So with that, let's jump into Xcode and see all of this in action. All right, so here I am in Xcode, and basically I've already got a video that shows how you start out a new project in Xcode, so we're going to skip all that. This is basically your Hello World screen. And notice here's this struct here, and this var body and these closed parens. Again, this is all boilerplate right here, these 4 lines, and we don't want to worry about it. What we're going to do is work in here. And then over here on the right, we see that we have our canvas. And again, if your canvas isn't showing, you can go up here to this little icon and look, just make sure that this is checked. Notice if I uncheck it, it goes away. If I click here and come back, I get the canvas again, and I can see the iPhone. Okay, so we have our code here. Notice when I click on the text here on this line, I get a blue box around the text view that's over here. So the great thing about this is the canvas is always working in parallel with the code. So let's suppose I wanted to, and just to prove that we're dynamically changing over here, if I typed in, how are you, we would see that sure enough, we basically are, whatever I am typing here is actually showing up over here. As we modify our code, our images change over here. So let's look at one of the modifiers that we wanted to do, which was foreground color. So one way to think about how we might do this is we can go over here onto our UI, and I can hold down the Command key and click the left mouse button, and I can come up here to Show SwiftUI Inspector. And when I do that, it's showing me a bunch of cool things that I could pick from that will actually modify this UI right here on our canvas. So one of them could be that we might want to say, I want the font to be much bigger. So we didn't do this in the slides, but let's try it here. So let's say we want it to be like a title font, which is going to be a standard size. It should be bigger and bolder than what we have now. So if I click that, and notice now how much bigger the text is. So this is now a title font size. But look what happened over here on the left. Over here on the left, it actually added a modifier in code right here. And that modifier is what's causing this to happen. So let's click on this again, Command left mouse button, Show Inspector. And if I look at the choices that were here, it looked like I could do body, or I could do footnote or caption. I bet caption's pretty small, but let's not do it from here. Let's go over here, and if I type in caption and click away, wow, look how small this got. So when I did some code here, this was immediately reflected here. So you see how these two are tied together. We can make changes over here, and it will write the code for us on the left-hand side. Or if we think it's easier to write some of the code, we can do that, and it will occur here on the right. So for example, I think it's easier for me to just type in title, and I'm now back to the title font that we had before. So let's add another modifier. In this case, we'll do the foreground color. So we can do, again, one of two things. I can come down here and I can type in dot, and in this case, I remember it's a foreground color, so I can say FORE, and sure enough, it's prompting me with an expansion of a foreground color that I could pick from. Now, if I didn't know foreground color, I just knew I wanted to change the color of the font, the other thing I can do is the same thing that I'm doing over here on the right, I can do that over here. So I can click on text because I want it, that's the view that I want to know about all its modifiers. And I can click the Command click, and I can say Show UI Inspector. And I get the same thing here that I got over here. Now I can go down here to Modifier at the bottom, and I get all of these modifiers that I can pick from. Now, the likelihood is that if I'm going to affect the color of the foreground, color is probably in the name. So I can type color, and then this will reduce down to any modifiers that have color in the name. And sure enough, here's one called foreground color. So I can click on that, foreground color, and in this case, it put in blue for us. That's great. Maybe I don't want blue, maybe I wanted orange. I could click orange. And when I click out of this, there I see that I now have my foreground color applied. Pretty cool, huh? So once you've done these a little bit, you're going to remember foreground color. It's just going to become automatic to you, and you'll just type it. So instead of me having this, I'm going to say, okay, I want the font, instead of it to be black, I want it to be blue. I'm just going to start typing foreground color, and I'm going to do color.blue, and voila, I have blue. So let's do another modifier. So that second modifier was a background. So we say dot background, and we notice when we start typing background, we don't get background color because, again, I said it when we were working with the slides, that all backgrounds can have a bunch of different things, not just color. So it's just going to complete for background. And then here we're going to put a different color. Let's say color.yellow like we had in the slides. And now we've actually applied a background color to the text. So let's go over here to the left side. We're going to click by doing Command left button and go to Show SwiftUI Inspector. And we see that we have a bunch of different, all the modifiers here like we had before. We could add more of them down here. But you'll notice that there's a padding section already here. And so that padding section is where we could add padding. Now keep in mind that the modifiers that are listed here graphically actually match the way they're typed here. And so what it's doing is it's saying, well, I'm going to put padding kind of in here before we actually do any background changes. But for our example, we want to do it in sort of after the fact. So we can type in padding here as well. And when we select padding, notice how it took the padding modifier out of here and moved it down. So now it's going to apply it as the last modifier. And then we're going to select this button. Let's put that back. And there it's applied. So now we have the padding here, and we see that we have this nice padding around our text view. And again, we said order matters, which means that if I reverse these two, so let's try that out. I'm going to take this one out and put it here. All of a sudden, we see that the yellow background has now been applied to the padding itself. So this shows you how easy it is to use the editor here, the code editor on this side and the canvas on this side, going back and forth to add new views and be able to see the code on the left side for how to create them and vice versa.